At Pepperdine, you'll not only see policy differently, you'll see your future differently from here too.
Good afternoon, I'm Pete Peterson, Dean here of Pepperdine School of Public Policy, and welcoming you here to the 2017 Constitution Day lecture with Dr. Darren Staloff. As we often say around the halls of SPP, one of our goals is to put the public back into public policy. And in one sense, that is a way of looking at the processes and the work of our Davenport Institute for Public Engagement and its work in training public sector officials and how to do a better job of engaging their residents. But in another sense, it's about considering that there is a public in public policy. There is a public to be consulted and a public to be considered. That public is a group of human beings that live in a particular place and in a particular time. And as we take this day to think back on our founding period, there is certainly a group of our founders who really did consider human nature and the public that they were ostensibly creating a government to serve and to govern. I think back on two particular questions raised by two of our founders. One is James Madison. I'm sure many of our first years are reading through the Federalist Papers, or if not, you should be soon. In Federalist 51, Madison wrote, and I quote, "But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature?" And in Federalist 15, Alexander Hamilton asked another question. He said, "But why has government been formed at all?" And then he answers by saying, "Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason without restraint." So we see in our founders this understanding that government was not just a matter of levers and organizations and structures meant to govern a group of robots, but it was really a human creation created for a particular people in a particular time. And certainly another one of our founders, John Adams, is one who also really did understand and contemplate that public policy was not some disembodied set of organizations and structures meant to govern some homo economicus, some rational being that always did A if you incentivized them with B. But was one who really considered that there was a human nature that needed to be considered in the creation of public policy. We are honored to be joined by Dr. Darren Staloff from the City College of New York today, an expert on the founding period who will lecture today and tell us a little bit more about John Adams and specifically this understanding that he brought to the creation of the Constitution and our founding principles, and knowing really in the beginning that there really is a public to be consulted in the creation of public policy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Darren Staloff.
Well, thank you, Dean Peterson. I'd like to thank Pepperdine for having me, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming on a cloudy but nonetheless nice day to commemorate an important event, an important conjuncture, the thing that makes us, we the people, our Constitution. Today I want to speak in particular about one figure, and that is one of the most unlikely national heroes, a rather bald, short, fat man with mutton chop whiskers, who, if you didn't know he was a founding father, would have thought he was cast for the part of George Costanza in Seinfeld. And that is John Adams. And what I want to do is examine John Adams' constitutional thought and his contribution to our thinking about constitutionalism and our constitutional regime. But I have to acknowledge at the outset that in assessing the constitutional thought of John Adams, it's impossible to avoid what I would call a curious paradox. On the one hand, he's certainly one of the most revered and central figures among our founding fathers. On the other, Adams is rarely considered as an important source of our constitutional traditions. Instead, both historians and political theorists generally agree in placing James Madison at the head of our class of constitutional founders, both for his role in the Philadelphia Convention in drafting the frame of government, and in his principal defense and explication of that frame in the Federalist and subsequent writings. Adams, serving abroad at the time, had no part in framing or defending that Constitution, despite the influence that his 3-volume Defense of the Constitutions of the United States had on some of the participants. Yet few, if any, of the founders wrote as consistently, trenchantly, and critically on the problem of constituting government as John Adams. And nor did any of them do it in such a sustained fashion. And I would argue the practical fruits of those writings, long predating the Philadelphia Convention of 1787, anticipated that body's results not only in forms, but also in procedures to a striking degree. So, in addressing this paradox with you as a window into the problem of Adams' constitutional thought, I want to explore 2 separate questions. First, and briefly, I want to examine why Adams was, in fact, our first, if not most important, constitutional founder. Second, and in greater depth, I want to consider why he hasn't been given that status. Now, some of the factors that have resulted in his diminished status are a function of what you have to acknowledge is, frankly, the tedious nature of his writings, and consequently, the considerable difficulty in interpreting them. But I also want to suggest that part of the problem lies in coming to grips with the nature of Adams' thought itself. For many scholars, the core of Adams' teaching remains elusive precisely because its critical, almost hyper-modernity is both striking and deeply disturbing. Its rather dour and almost tragic lessons, its deep sense of human limitation, and the fallen sense of social and political life cast our constitutional arrangements in a light that is almost baroque in its darkness and shadow. First, the brief part. Why should Adams be considered possibly our greatest constitutional founder? Well, quite recently, the distinguished political theorist James Caesar has offered 4 criteria that demark the uniquely American tradition of constitutional founding. The first of these was that the American founding, unlike, for example, its British organic and contract antecedents, quote, returned founding to political science. And it did so in a self-conscious fashion. What do I mean by that? I mean that framing a government was neither a result of fortune or a self-emergent order, but was the result of reflection and rigorous rumination that would promote the well-being and order of the community. This was, of course, precisely the point that Alexander Hamilton made in the very first paragraph of the very first Federalist essay. For Hamilton, the key question facing the American people at that critical juncture was, and I quote, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice. The deployment of reflection and choice, or what Professor Caesar called political science, has been widely attributed to such ancient lawgivers, or had been widely attributed to such ancient lawgivers and constitutional statements as Lycurgus of Sparta and Solon of Athens. And it was what differentiated them from early modern regimes that had adapted in moments of crisis and disruption, and were thus forced, in Hamilton's phrase, quote, to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. Yet 12 years before Hamilton penned this essay, Adams had already articulated the same point. He put it in his 1776 Thoughts on Government, quote, the divine science of politics is the science of social happiness, and the blessings of society depend entirely on the constitutions of government. 4 years earlier, he had told his fellow residents of Braintree that, quote, men are the objects of this science, and that this in turn entailed a study of both human nature and human history. Well, a second criteria that Professor Caesar identified was an awareness of just how distinct constitutional founding was from any other sort of legislation. How, in the current context, just as in that of the ancient lawgivers I previously mentioned, quote, great men were called upon to perform great deeds at a critical moment. And it was precisely such deeds at such a moment that Adams evoked more than a decade before the Philadelphia Convention. It has been the will of heaven, he wrote to John Penn, this is in early 1776, that we should be thrown into existence at a period when the greatest philosophers and lawgivers of antiquity would have wished to live. A time when 13 colonies were offered, quote, an opportunity of beginning government anew from the foundation and building as they choose. Now, a third criterion that is distinctive, and I think this has a distinctively American and Lockean flavor to it, entailed the fulfillment of, quote, a requirement of regular consent. And it's important to recognize this is very distinctively American in the 18th century. There was, outside of Parliament, no consent to the Glorious Revolution. The convention that adopted the new Constitution of Revolutionary France was not subject to popular approval. So, in the case of our federal Constitution, we know how this was done. This was enacted through the novel idea of popular ratification of the frame itself in state conventions. But this radically innovative piece of constitutional architecture, the calling of a convention whose product would be subject to popular ratification, had been anticipated by John Adams in the summer of 1775 and proposed before Congress and memorialized in both letters and his thoughts on government for each of the 13 colonies. He was the one who articulated the idea of a separate convention aside from the legislature. He was the one who said it must be submitted to the people for ratification before it can be enacted. Finally, the last criterion identified is that this frame be the object of a fitting reverence, what we're doing precisely this day, that marks it apart from traditional legislation and gives it an appropriate symbolic resonance, binding us as a nation, as a people, as a community. And as Professor Caesar noted wisely, that simply was not the case with the state constitutions before the Federal Convention. Most of them had been revised several times by then and have since. But there is one exception, and that is the Massachusetts Constitution of 1779 and 1780 that was drafted by none other than John Adams, who again was briefly home on leave from diplomatic duty. Adams' Constitution was in fact treated with something at least close to reverence. It's the only original Constitution in the United States that has never been revoked or replaced. But perhaps most striking of all is the fact that the constitutional frames Adams proffered directly anticipated the checks and balances of the federal Constitution through its unique combination of separation of powers on one hand and mixed government on the other. The model Constitution presented in Thoughts on Government is almost a direct anticipation of Madison's Virginia plan, with a popularly elected House of Representatives choosing a Senate and unitary executive with a legislative veto and powers of appointment with the advice and consent of the Senate. Even more striking is the provision that once chosen, the judiciary should serve as a separate branch of government with fixed salaries and life tenures limited only by, quote, good behavior. Now, each of these positions were extremely controversial at the time of the Revolution. The most popular revolutionary writing of the time, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, had called for simple unicameral legislatures, one-body legislatures, that would represent the, quote, will of the people. And several states, most famously Pennsylvania, Georgia, Vermont, had actually adopted those plans. Indeed, aside from New York, no state endowed their executive with a legislative veto. In no small part because in the colonial period, the governors had generally been chosen by and represented the crown. So most of the new states sought to make the executive as weak as possible. Judicial officials had also served at the pleasure of the crown, and so in the first state constitutions were generally rendered as dependent as possible on the legislature. It should also be noted that the frame Adams presented in Thoughts on Government was written in response for advice from several statesmen from Virginia and North Carolina. When he drafted a frame for his own state some few years later, it was far closer to the final constitutional pattern of Philadelphia. Now, the House and Senate were both popularly elected, although Senate districts were based on wealth rather than population. The executive was also popularly elected, and the judiciary was, of course, fully independent. But what really stands out is in 1779, a Declaration of Rights that contains versions of each of our first 8 amendments to our Constitution. Finally, why was there more popular voting in the Massachusetts Constitution than the one he suggested for his Southern friends? Because, as we'll see, Adams thought that constitutions needed to account for the stratifications and features of the societies they governed. And he didn't believe that the elite nature of Southern society would afford much confidence in popular voting for higher offices, a view which seems to have correctly anticipated Madison's predilections and preferences. So given that Adams anticipated both the larger thinking about the nature of American founding and the precise frame that resulted from that founding, why hasn't he been associated with American constitutionalism? If not, given pride of place? Well, perhaps the most obvious answer, and one that is ineluctable once one's immersed in his works, is that he was a painfully obtuse writer. Those who have read him, and I'm not talking about his captivating and electric correspondence, know exactly what I mean. When he's not simply quoting from primary sources for pages on end, he's more likely than not to bury his topic sentence or main point in the penultimate or preceding sentence of a 12-sentence paragraph. Once one can find the major claims hidden in the midst of paragraphs, one is often thrown off the scent of the argument by a digression that can last anywhere from 1 to several paragraphs, only to finally meander back to the original argument in a subsequent chapter. And of course, he can be repetitive to the point of nausea. In short, Adams had a fertile, indeed furtive mind, but he lacked any serious editorial self-control and often made a point only to amplify it, then qualify it, and then restate it twice more. The second reason, and one directly resulting from the first, is that it's very difficult sometimes to interpret Adams. Occasionally, this is a result of the kind of loose associative nature of his prose, but sometimes it results from the peculiar tendency he has to adopt vocabularies that do not reflect his thought. So let me give you one obvious example. He had a proclivity for writing in categories generally associated with what scholars call classical or ancient Republican thought. For example, his early claim is that the end of government is human happiness. Now this is reminiscent of the eudaimonic doctrines of the ancient world, their quest for the highest good, the noble status of man. And the similarity is even more striking when he claims, as he does in Thoughts on Government, and his Constitution of Massachusetts, by the way, that happiness consists in virtue. Now, such a claim, coupled with the fact that his constitutional frames do bear a striking similarity to the Aristotelian or Polybian ideal of polity, has led the celebrated historian Gordon Wood to conclude that Adams was the last of the classical thinkers on politics. Despite his brilliance, he was utterly irrelevant to the thought of the founders of American constitutionalism. And yet, there's something odd about this conclusion, not because Adams did not speak in ways that were in fact classical, but because the things he actually said were anything but classical. Again, I want to give just one critical examination to pursue what we've already put out. Adams does claim virtue is essential to happiness, but then the virtues he elucidates are far from classical. In fact, they're strikingly modern. Let me quote. These are the virtues he lays out in his Constitution. The principles of humanity and general benevolence, public and private charity, industry, frugality, honesty, punctuality in your dealings, sincerity, good humor, and all social affections and generous sentiments among the people. These are the desired character traits listed at the close of his Constitution of 1779. None of these could be found in ancient thought. None of them could be found in medieval thought. What's missing? All of the traditional virtues of the classical ideal. Never mentions self-sacrifice, never mentions courage, public-mindedness, all of the other ideas associated with classical republicanism. To the contrary, these are the very virtues that the political economist Deirdre McCloskey has lovingly characterized as, quote, bourgeois. And these are exactly the kind of virtues we would find in the worldly Benjamin Franklin's table of virtues. Adams, I would argue, has befuddled his readers by quite often pouring modern wine into ancient bottles. In fact, I would argue Adams' thought is thoroughly modern. Its methods certainly could not be more modern. Adams' political science eschews guiding theories rooted in self-evident first principles and opts instead for a Baconian reading of history. Indeed, central to the vast bulk of his written work is the telling and interpretation of historical events and conjunctures. In this telling, constitutional regimes and revolutions are, quote, experiments, demonstrating how particular modes functioned in restraining potential sources of disorder within a particular society and a particular moment of development. The other central component of his science is a reading of human nature, derived from Scottish moral sense doctrine. The two are woven together by showing how various personality dispositions have manifested themselves historically and how they have been restrained or channeled by various regimes. Further complicating this weaving is the fact that Adams' understanding of history itself is fully modern. Where Charles' second act, the famed Baron Montesquieu, could see the different mores of the Romans and contemporary France as varying with the form of the regime, the extent of its domain, its climactic and geographic features, John Adams added to that picture a developmental dimension of history, one that he drew from the great Scottish philosophic historians, William Robertson, David Hume, Adam Ferguson, even Adam Smith in Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, as well as their English disciple, Edward Gibbon. The way human drives might manifest themselves then not only varied with the factors that Montesquieu revealed, they also changed with the basic stage of stadial productive development, from hunting and gathering to pastoralism, agriculture, and commerce and manufactures. Adams had thus delved into almost the entire toolkit of the most modern and cutting-edge social and political science of his day, and I would argue ours. Even more modern than his method was Adams' constitutional teaching itself. Hamilton may have been somewhat more worldly in his embrace of commercial republicanism, but Adams' worldliness is suffused with an almost unrivaled air of disillusionment and disenchantment. It is this air that gives Adams an almost hyper-modern flavor, but it's also, I would argue, what limits his appeal. Adams' teachings are about limits and constraints, and the fundamentally fallen and imperfect nature of human being and association. These, I would argue, are hardly themes most scholars or citizens are disposed to wrap our constitutional order in. Adams did, of course, embrace the Republican regime as the best, but he insisted that there was an unlimited number of forms such a regime might take, each best suited to a particular configuration of social classes and orders at a particular stage of economic and cultural development. Thus, for example, to Adams, the notion of imposing a democratic or even purely republican constitution on a French society largely composed of, in his account, 40 million illiterate peasants, was a violation of any sound political science. The best that a reasonable statesman could hope to achieve was some moderate but firm reforms that gradually changed the regime towards that of a British-style constitutional monarchy, while developing its commercial society. Anything more was an invitation for chaos, disaster, and terror. Adams said this as early as the Assembly of the Notables in 1787. And he said it in both his defense and his discourses in Davila. He said it early, he said it often. This was not a popular thing to say, and it became even less popular when history bore it out as true. The presentation of Adams' teachings was, as I have suggested, often opaque and fragmentary. But the content is, I think, profound. What I want to offer, in as brief a fashion as I can, is a rational reconstruction of a few central threads of his thought. So let's begin with the anti-Aristotelian claim that Adams makes, that man is primarily a social and only secondarily a political animal. Thus, like Hobbes, the political exists for the sake of the social, and the social is grounded in human nature, human psychology, or human sensibility. Humans are bound together not only by need, as Hobbes thought, but also by disposition, specifically a set of social instincts, the most striking of which, for Adams at least, was benevolence. Unfortunately, humans are also driven by selfish instincts. And these instincts and interests are generally more powerful than social feelings like benevolence and compassion. Fortunately, there exists a third set of morally neutral drives, which can be either social or antisocial, depending on how the regime is organized. The most striking and important of these, at least for Adams, was what he called the passion for distinction. What does this mean? Well, more than anything, I'm giving you the quick reconstruction, anything except for fulfilling your most basic animal needs, every human wants to be recognized, validated, and valued by those around them. This passion can take many forms: envy, jealousy, ambition, emulation. But it's universal. It's to be found in every social strata, in all epochs of human development. Although ultimately a kind of vanity, the passion for distinction is also a potential source of social solidarity. And this is because that distinction is often most easily secured through actions that benefit others. Indeed, the inherently powerful potential of the passion for social distinction, for social cooperation between strata, lies in the fact, as Adam Smith first noted in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, that distinction is ultimately conferred by spectators situated throughout the social order. We are the ones who give others their distinctions. While this passion for distinction thus makes us useful to each other, it also draws us apart. It does so because it is essentially agonistic and is played as a zero-sum game. This means that society will inevitably, society in general and each sub-community, each dorm room almost, will stratify between elites or, quote, aristocrats who win widespread distinction and deference, and the rest of us. This stratification is natural in two senses. In the first sense, it's natural because it's rooted in the natural passion for distinction of the elite. But in the second and more profound sense, it's natural because it's rooted in the moral psychology of the rest of us. Again, drawing on the teaching of Adam Smith, Adams argued that people defer to the wealthy, for example. Not because they think the wealthy are inherently better people, we're not foolish, but because the human mind instinctually transfers the supposed pleasures of wealth and the hopes of beneficence or generosity from its beholder to the holder. By contrast, we instinctually recoil from the sight of poverty due to its association with privation and discomfort, and the uneasiness at the plight of others that it triggers in us. Wealth is not the only source, of course, of aristocratic distinction. Adams also notes the deference people confer on beauty, on birth or family names, on learning. Nor is this an inherently bad thing, since these various bases of elite status can result in their bearers conferring tangible benefits and pleasures on the rest of us. Moreover, since this process of social stratification is natural, any attempt to create social equality through political or constitutional means is chimerical. Even massacring the elites, which has been tried several times, only results in their recurrence and reemergence as fresh figures capture the public imagination. In short, aristocrats or elites are part of the human condition. And in a large commercial and therefore opulent society, as the United States was likely to become before too long, Adams thought those elites would become increasingly powerful and more than an overmatch for the common citizenry. The only solution he had seen work was to ostracize them in a Senate. This could be done by craftily using the passion for distinction against the elites. Give senators fancy titles and honors, award shows, surround them with a little pomp, or find some way to make the office more attractive than that of a mere representative. This arrangement had two great benefits. The first is that it ensures that at least one part of the legislature, the popular house, is capable at least of some representation of the interests of the common citizenry in all of their variety. But the second is that it pits each of the most distinguished elites against each other in a struggle for preeminence, one which is likely to prod at least a few of them to acts of great virtue and public merit in the hopes of eclipsing their rivals. This is not merely pitting ambition against ambition, as Madison argued. This is pitting soaring ego against overweening will to power. Indeed, Adams here is acting almost precisely the part of Mandeville's statesman, who arranges the regime and its laws to turn the private vice of vanity into the public benefit of republican virtue and talent. Adams' attempt to use the passion for distinction against the ambition of the elites and their attempts to dominate the common citizenry thus exemplifies Mandeville's core socio-ethical teaching. Thus, virtue was the progeny that flattery begot upon pride. Adams' teaching on aristocracy was perhaps his most controversial, and certainly has remained his most misunderstood. Adams was not defending aristocratic elites, certainly didn't think they were a good thing. His notion of nature was Baconian, not Rousseauian. And as such, when he said that aristocracy is natural, he was simply saying that it was empirically given, that it was universal. He did not see nature as the ground of an inherently normative order. It was simply what was evidentially present. He was, however, warning that eliminating titles and hereditary honors, primogeniture and entail, as Thomas Jefferson did, or any other legal distinctions, while certainly salutary, would not eliminate the presence of people with more power and influence than others. And those people would be naturally ambitious at the expense of the larger political community. nor would he accept the distinction made by Jefferson and others between the natural aristocracy of virtue and talent and the, quote, artificial aristocracy of wealth and birth. To begin with, as Adams insisted, wealth and birth are generally the principal source of the resources necessary to acquire learning, and the leisure and odium necessary to enable one to live according to virtue. Moreover, even when educational opportunities were made somewhat more available, and Adams, as one of the few plebeian founders we had, insisted that a fully higher liberal education could never be made fully universal. But even if made more broadly available, an educated elite was still an elite, and just as likely to be selfish and ambitious as any oligarch or titled lord. Adams didn't deny that a meritocratic educated elite could be the source of immense boons to both state and society. He thought he was that. But he also noted that it had also been, and often been, the source of great rancor, repression, and fanaticism. There was nothing more natural or beneficial in genuflecting or deferring to one sort of elite than another. They all had virtues, they all had dangers. If one had to characterize Adams' basic stance towards aristocracy, it would be a combination of awe at their power and accomplishments, and fear of their power and ambition. A combination probably natural to his own status as a parvenu within that elite. Herein perhaps lies one of the chief differences between his view of faction and Madison, who was secure in his elite status and was thus neither as impressed by it or fearful of it. If a separation of the two broad orders of society into distinct legislative chambers was thus a Republican necessity, lest one side overwhelm the other, a third principle, equally important, had to be introduced, lest the first two, popular folk and elites, engage in ceaseless political strife. And for Adams, this was the role of the executive. The executive would be a third balancing power within the legislature, one that stood between the elite Senate and the representatives of the common citizens. A wise and statesmanlike executive would serve his function by sometimes finding common ground between the bodies and their factions, but more often by limiting the intensity and frequency of the conflict. Obviously, the only way an executive could have enough power to do this was to be fully independent of either the House or Senate, just as the only way to ensure the laws would be faithfully interpreted would be to make the judiciary independent of both the legislature and the executive. But the most important role of the executive arose when one party, one faction, or one interest threatened to gain a real advantage over the other. The key role of the executive in balancing and therefore preserving the Republican order was to always side with the weaker party, lest its rival permanently distort the regime in its favor. So I would like to end these remarks with a couple observations about this teaching. First, it has a rather dark, fallen, almost as I've suggested, Ephesian character to it. Republican political life is characterized by a never-ending struggle for influence and distinction, both within the elite and the common citizenry, and between them. In such a scenario, there's little likelihood of a broad apprehension of the common or public good, very little chance of finding the general will. Indeed, outside of a few broadly shared desideratum and the exigencies of intermittent crises and emergencies, the likely tenor of such a regime would be constant partisan and social strife and partisan gridlock. The regime offers each order weapons to defend itself and attack its rival, and places the executive as referee. His goal is not to make sure the fight is fairly won, but rather that it is never won, that the fight goes on for as long as possible. It is in that sense a rather tragic view of the best political life. Moreover, it is a life racing against an historical clock, hoping to stave off the day when one of the elites will be able to successfully play the popular demagogue and undermine, if not undo, the entire order. I think it's this bleak sense of the political that has driven scholars away from seeking the roots of American constitutionalism and Adams' teaching. But I also think that while there is a Hobbesian element to this teaching, I'm not going to deny it, I don't think it's its core. Its most fundamental teaching, I think, is, as I've suggested before, Mandevillian and much more positive, even if in a worldly and disenchanted way. While strife might well be endemic and ineluctable, it's restrained within Republican and purely political forms. And the genius of the Republican order is that it provides the impartial rule of law. That rule of law allows people to cooperate in their local communities, forming bonds of affection and mutual support that give meaning and a horizon to their collective experience. And of course, at the individual level, it provides the context for the living of a free and independent life. And perhaps most importantly, it provides the security for each person to freely pursue her own ideals of happiness and distinction, itself an essential component of the cultural and social development and flourishing of both the larger community and the human personality. Freedom and the rule of law are therefore not the preconditions of Republican government, they are its highest fruits or ends. Partisan and social strife within the regime is merely the price we need to pay to maintain it. To express how thoroughly modern this teaching is, I want to wrap it in a quasi-Marxist idiom. If you've read the Communist Manifesto, you'll recognize the turn of phrase. History is indeed the history of class and social struggles. In a free society, those struggles are vibrant, constrained, and ultimately unresolved. To conclude on a Mandevillian note, freedom, then, is the progeny that Republican envy begot on elite ambition. Thank you.
Well, before the reception at 1, which for students means food, we have about 10 or 15 minutes for some questions. So raise your hand. I believe there's some microphones that will go out so that they'll be recorded. So raise your hands.
I probably don't need it. If the president was supposed to function as a referee, I'm assuming when you said executive, I'm assuming you're referring to the president. So was there any thought of that being a nonpartisan position?
Absolutely. It was this was the great surprise, was for Adams that the president became partisan. Washington prided himself on being nonpartisan. Adams literally, when the Federalists were at the point of defeating the Jeffersonians, finally, he sided with the Jeffersonians and made sure he wouldn't be reelected, because he thought that's what a president does. When one side is about to win, you have to betray your own. Otherwise, you don't have loyalty to them. So remember, in the founding generation, they did not yet have the idea of legitimate opposition.
Where's the microphone?
Thank you, Professor. So my question is, I'm currently reading the Federalist paper in the next 2 weeks, and I found there is the use of one vocabulary of people that draw my interest. Because when we are reading the similar text from more continental tradition, for example, in French, from Montesquieu to the text in French Revolution, we found like they are more tend to use the word citizens. When we are reading the text from the traditional American Revolution, they use the vocabulary of people. So like in this situation, I wonder if this differentiation demonstrated this kind of sense of modernity within the American Revolution, which when the founding father of U.S. Constitution intentionally driving themselves away from this kind of more classical ideal of citizens, but trying to construct a new ideal of this kind of this kind of entity of different community within the republic. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and you're right. There are really two wonderful moments around 1776 when the people become evoked as a principle, and the other is precisely in the Federalist Papers and even in the Constitution itself. We the people. And I think part of what drove that was a sense that both of those projects were tenuous, and they were trying to, I don't want to use the word propaganda, but certainly to reach out and galvanize as much of a public as possible. One of the reasons that Adams is not broadly assigned is Adams is the last of the New England secular Puritans. He refuses to do that. And he consistently says, don't use the word people. It's a lie. We don't let children vote, and we don't let women vote, and I can tell you my wife knows more than I've forgotten. So we're not perfect, we're not close to it yet, and we won't be for a long time. The people are not what rules here. What rules here are citizens. So that's one of the reasons why Adams, Franklin had a great line about him. He said, you know, he's always honest. He just can't help but tell the truth. He's often profound. But precisely because he's always honest and often profound, he's sometimes downright out of his mind. Right? He says what you just should never say in public. And one of them, and he writes about this a lot to John Taylor of Carolina, don't talk about the people. That's just demagoguery. We don't want a democracy in this country. You wouldn't want it, and I wouldn't want it. And you're not going to let children vote, and you're not going to let poor people vote. So don't pretend otherwise. That's an excellent question. Thank you.
Darren, if Adams believed that inequality is inevitable, how would he speak to the current social justice regime? And would he be right?
You know, I think Adams it was always at two sides. And I think one side would be, boy, do I appreciate what's driving you, right? It's a salutary thing. The other thing he'd say is, if you really think you're going to believe that, then I could sell you a bridge connecting Manhattan and Brooklyn. It's just not going to go away. You can ameliorate things. You can make them better. You certainly should try. But the idea that you're going to achieve complete equality never happened, never will. You can pick the most egalitarian regimes in the world and the people still have billions and while the other people starve. Just, that's the people. Where, you know, it's a Madisonian line. If men were angels, they would need no government, right? But we're not. And so what you do, you have to plan a government for people who, most of us are good, but some of us are going to game it. And, you know, you can't tell who they are. The people who scream for justice, they could be the biggest gamers of all. In fact, history's shown they often are.
Thank you very much for speaking today. You mentioned that John Adams often saw history as Baconian, or thought of politics as a science, sort of the first political science, or one of the first. My question is, can you identify or trace a political science tradition following from John Adams through the 1800s, before more recent traditions sort of came into being in the 1900s?
I think you could trace many of them. Do you mean in the United States or just globally?
In the United States.
You know, in a weird way, if you read Martin Van Buren's writing about party, it's also very worldly, where he says, you know, people are going to, that parties are useful, not because they're committed to high ideals. They're not. They're about stealing everything that isn't nailed down. But if you balance them, neither of them can get away with stealing, and you actually get stuff done. And that's a kind of very Adamsian, realistic view of parties. Not one that almost, somewhat different from Burke's defense. Burke thought that parties could be a little more principled than Van Buren. I'm painting Van Buren in very New York dark colors. He also thought they could be somewhat principled. But in American, unfortunately, I'd say that in some ways the closest you get is, I have a colleague who's writing about Lincoln, and he argues that Lincoln had an ideal of political friendship. which is based on the idea that we're going to have different convictions, different interests, and that we need to find a way to get along without killing each other, and trusting the better instincts of each, as long as we can agree on certain Republican fundamentals, right? Like slavery's bad, you should be compensated for your labor. And I think that's also the same sort of sense. And also the Lincolnian sense that there is a historical trajectory. When you enter the age of commerce and manufacturers, slavery is just reactionary. Things have changed. It just can't happen anymore. So it's hard to find in the 19th century because the Jacksonians win. And we get, quote, the social justice wins and democracy wins and equality, and, you know, we all get confused.
Our last question.
Hi, thank you for being here, Professor. Appreciate hearing from you. I know we didn't get to talk a lot about personal influences, but I'm really interested in what you have to say about John Adams and his relationship with his wife, Abigail Adams, and how that sort of influenced everything that he did, but just specifically tying back to what you were talking about, I just want to touch on her a little bit.
Okay, yeah, that's it's an interesting question. John Adams, as I mentioned, was a plebeian founder. He's the first member of his family to go to college. His father was a very small farmer who had to work as a cordwainer, which is a shoe repairman, in the winter. And he married up. He married a minister's daughter who was quite well educated. So, and she was extremely thoughtful. Did she influence him? Profoundly. But he was still his own man, which is to say, big difference between them. Abigail Adams, he was pretty tough. I mean, some people might argue he's a sort of founder of American conservatism, as an intellectual, a philosophical tradition. Abigail Adams was certainly much harder and stricter than him. She thought, you know, John, you're a good man, but you're too good for this world. You're too kind to your opponents. You're too forgiving. Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts. He didn't think very highly of them. Abigail loved them. She said, you know, if they don't want to be loyal Americans, get them out. And if they're going to attack an elected government that is being attacked by a foreign power, then John, why are you so soft? You've got to, you know, grow a spine. And she really was a remarkable person. And I think he had immense respect for her, but they were different personalities. He was a little bit more of a softie.
Thank you.
Well, join me in thanking Professor Staloff once again.